late December 1944. While the Germans are launching their last gamble on the Western Front, which was known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Soviets arrive in Budapest and besiege the city. There, some 90,000 German-Hungarian soldiers, along with more than 800,000 civilians, are isolated. From here on, the situation is going to be very similar to that which had occurred 2 years earlier in Stalingrad, although, as we will see later on this occasion, the commander of the garrison did dare to initiate a desperate escape that practically ended in tragedy. Well, having said that, let's begin with today's program, in which we are going to analyze how the 3 German rescue attempts on Budapest were during the entire month of January 1945, known as the Konrad operations. When the Soviets surrounded the Hungarian capital at Christmas 1944, the Germans had almost all their offensive-capable units tied up on the Western Front. The few remaining units in a relatively quiet sector were General Otto Gill's 4th SS Panzer Corps with the Totenkopf and Viking divisions of the Waffen SS. This Panzer Corps was in the vicinity of Warsaw, where it had been involved in intense fighting in the previous months to defend the new front on the Vistula. Despite all reports warning that the Soviets were going to attack this sector imminently in what would be known as the Vistula-Oder offensive, the Germans had no choice but to weaken this area and send the 4th SS Panzer Corps to Hungary. It took about a week for the German elite divisions to be moved by train to the vicinity of the city of Komárom, about 75 kilometers west of Budapest. Once there, the Germans had 2 possible options to reach the Hungarian capital. The first was to attack directly from there in an easterly direction, having to cross 2 mountain ranges. The second option was to head further south, to the vicinity of Lake Balaton, and start the assault from there. Although there were no mountains to cross in this sector, the route was considerably longer, and there were numerous canals in the area that could greatly hinder the advance of the tanks. Finally, the decision was made to attack through the mountain systems of Vertes and Gershi because it was the shortest route and the one they could start first. This is how Operation Konrad I was born, in which, in addition to these 2 armored divisions of the Waffen SS, the 96th and 711th Infantry Divisions participated. Between all these units, they added up to approximately 70,000 men and some 262 tanks. The offensive of the 4th SS Panzer Corps began on the afternoon of January 1st, after a diversionary attack had been launched the previous day in the vicinity of Lake Balaton. With the Totenkopf Division on the left flank and the Viking Division on the right flank, right in the middle of the Gersh Mountains, the offensive did not start badly for the Germans, but there was no doubt that the pace was too slow. Although the advance was being made through a mountainous area in the middle of winter, speed was crucial, as they could not give their enemy time to react. The German attack continued for the next 8 days, suffering many hardships until they were finally stuck about 25 kilometers from Budapest. During this period, all requests from the Budapest garrison commander to initiate a breakthrough attack from the interior were rejected. Furthermore, north of the Danube, the Soviets launched a major offensive on January 6th that nearly cut off the entire logistics line of the 4th SS Panzer Corps and left it isolated along with the troops trapped in Budapest. The reasons for the failure of this first operation were many. One of the most important things was that the Germans launched the offensive before they were fully prepared and before all their troops had arrived. Thus, at the time of the start of the attack, only half of the necessary fuel had been gathered, and only 66% of the Totenkopf Division, 32% of the Viking Division, and 43% of the 96th Infantry Division's troops had arrived. This meant that the German spearheads were quite weak, and they had to be reinforced piecemeal as the rest of the unit's troops arrived. In addition, the infantry divisions also did not make good progress and were unable to fulfill their task of securing the flanks of the SS armored divisions. Thus, both the Viking and Totenkopf divisions had to open up more and more until they lost their offensive power. Another important factor was the practically null result of the 1st Panzer Division in its diversionary attack on the town of Osi, which lasted less than 24 hours and barely attracted Soviet attention. Lastly, and no less important, Soviet resistance was greater than expected, and after being able to receive constant reinforcements due to the German slowness, they were gradually absorbing the German onslaught. All these factors were compiled by the German commanders, who quickly set to work on a new rescue operation in which they would try to rectify the greatest number of errors that had occurred during the first 8 days of January. This new offensive would be known as Operation Konrad II. One of the greatest successes during Operation Konrad I was achieved by the 711th Infantry Division near Esztergom on the south bank of the Danube. Otto Giel therefore decided to concentrate his efforts in that area due to the low Soviet presence. For the new offensive, the Viking Division was redeployed to launch an attack towards Budapest from Esztergom, while the Totenkopf Division remained on the defensive, protecting the right flank. Thus, the Viking Division was to cross the Pilis Mountains, where the terrain was more favorable from Pilis-Lelek, approaching Budapest from this sector. Giel planned to use an airfield at Pomaz to establish an air bridge to help the besieged in Budapest break through the Soviet encirclement. However, German weakness and the lack of properly coordinated reinforcements made the situation very complicated. Although Hitler initially interfered, he eventually allowed Operation Konrad II to begin on January 10th, although the chances of success and of evacuating Budapest were limited due to lack of preparation and Hitler's obstinacy not to abandon the capital. Despite an initial delay, the attack began on the evening of January 10th. The German 711th Infantry Division advanced slowly due to the mountainous and snowy terrain, but managed to breach the Soviet defenses near Pilis-Lelek. The Viking Division was able to advance from 20-30 hours, although its progress was halted at dawn on January 11th. In parallel, Kampfgruppe Philipp was stopped by Soviet forces near Pilis-Marot. Weather conditions, with a thaw turning the terrain into a quagmire, further complicated the advance. Although the forces of Viking and the 711th Division managed to advance some 5 to 7 kilometers, Philipp's troops were forced back by Soviet counterattacks. To the south, at Zamali, German forces launched another offensive on January 9th, facing well-established Soviet defenses. Despite an initial breakthrough, Soviet counterattacks and poor weather conditions halted the German advance. On January 11th, it became clear that Viking's offensive needed further support. Hitler requested to call off the operation and move the 4th SS Panzer Corps to Zamali, but Balck, commander of the 6th Army, decided to continue and ordered the Totenkopf Division to join the attack. However, the situation at Totenkopf was not favorable for a significant advance. On January 12th, the Viking Division was still fighting at Pilis-Karest, but the orders from its commander, Otto Giel, were confusing. Giel feared that Hitler was dissatisfied with the slow advance and that the offensive would be called off. He tried to prevent this by contacting Himmler to ask Hitler for more time. However, Hitler decided to cancel Operation Konrad II, arguing that it had no chance of success, dared the 4th SS Panzer Corps to be moved to the Zamali sector. Thus, even though the vanguard of the Viking Division was only 18 kilometers from Budapest, the German troops were ordered to withdraw. It should be noted that it was at the very moment of the cancellation of Operation Konrad II that the Soviets launched their major attack on the Vistula, which completely annihilated the German troops in Poland. However, far from suspending all activity in Hungary in order to send reinforcements to the Oder, Hitler ordered a new operation to be designed to try to liberate Budapest. Known as Konrad III, it was the largest of the 3 German attacks. Preparations for Operation Konrad III began before the cancellation of the previous operation. Hitler and General Balck preferred this new plan, which aimed to isolate the Soviet forces between the Danube and the Vertes Mountains, re-establish contact with Budapest, and attack the enemy troops west of the Danube. The offensive was set for January 18th, although the German army faced serious difficulties such as fuel shortages. The 4th SS Panzer Corps, along with other divisions, was to lead the operation, but despite planning, a lack of infantry and a shortage of resources complicated the situation. The Totenkopf and Viking divisions had a limited number of operational vehicles and a serious shortage of infantrymen, which threatened the effectiveness of the offensive. Although they managed to prepare the movement of troops and maintain the secrecy of the operation, the problem of having poorly equipped units could put the new mission at risk. At 4:30 a.m., the 6th Army, under Balck's command, began its offensive after a heavy bombardment of 400 artillery pieces. Despite the dense fog that limited visibility, the German forces surprised the Soviet defenses, which did not expect the attack. The Totenkopf and Viking divisions of the 4th SS Panzer Corps managed to advance quickly towards the central sector, reaching the town of Tak, while the 3rd Panzer Division easily broke through to Deg. The 1st Panzer Division faced significant resistance in the town of Osi, which had been fortified after previous attacks, but also managed to advance towards Székesfehérvár. Over the course of the first day, the 4th Panzer Corps achieved a front breakthrough between 30 kilometers wide and 18 to 25 kilometers deep. The Luftwaffe also played a crucial role by bombing retreating Soviet units and carrying out reconnaissance missions. However, the 3rd Panzer Corps, which had begun its attack a day earlier, met with strong resistance at Sarkarestes and barely made any headway. Despite the initial success of the offensive, the situation in Budapest was becoming critical for the German and Hungarian troops, who were losing ground in the eastern part of the city. However, the German attack forced the Soviets to concentrate their forces on containing the offensive, temporarily relieving the pressure on the encircled troops. On January 19th, Balck gave orders for the IV Corps divisions to continue advancing towards their objectives, while maintaining limited attacks in the Verte Mountains to distract and pin down Soviet forces there. In addition, Balck ordered the troops encircled in Budapest to prepare for a possible withdrawal to the southwest. Early on January 19th, weather conditions favored German forces, with fog and cold temperatures hampering Red Air Force reconnaissance. The Viking Division advanced rapidly, taking the villages of Kislang and Sarost and approaching the Danube, while the Totenkopf faced initial problems in resuming its offensive due to the need to repair bridges, although it eventually advanced as far as near Seragelies. The 1st Panzer Division was also successful in protecting the Totenkopf's left flank, although it failed to take the town of Székesfehérvár, which remained in Soviet hands. On the other hand, the 3rd Panzer Division achieved a significant breakthrough, reaching Dunaújváros, thus dividing the Soviet forces. Balck was pleased with the progress, but his optimism led him to give orders for more aggressive attacks to the south, thinking that the Soviet forces were exhausted. However, the Soviets began to mobilize new units to respond to the German offensive. By January 20th, the vanguard of the Totenkopf and Viking divisions were 50 kilometers from Budapest, hoping to reach the Hungarian capital quickly. However, the Soviets, realizing the German intentions, launched a counterattack that threatened the left flank of the 3rd Panzer Division, raising concerns among the German leadership. Soviet troop movements indicated that the Germans were in a vulnerable situation, as they lacked sufficient infantry divisions to secure the conquered areas. As the day progressed, the situation became chaotic, with intense fighting and an unclear front line. German divisions had to retreat in the face of Soviet attacks, resulting in a halt to their offensive towards Budapest. On January 21st, fighting continued with the aim of driving Soviet units out of their positions. The Totenkopf and Viking divisions managed to secure their supply lines and resume their offensive towards Budapest. However, their forces had been significantly diminished, with few operational vehicles and a reduced number of troops. Despite the difficulties, the attack continued, although casualties and winter conditions had begun to affect the morale and health of the troops. In a critical turn, Soviet Marshal Tolbukin was pressured by Stalin to keep his units from retreating, which would mark a turning point in the operation, keeping the Soviets in the fight and prolonging the conflict in the region. During the early hours of January 22nd, the Viking Totenkopf and part of the 1st Panzer Division resumed their attack northwards with the aim of crossing the Vali River and approaching Budapest. However, the 4th SS Panzer Corps faced severe difficulties as its combat capability had been reduced by more than 50% since the start of the operation. Only 142 operational tanks remained out of the initial 311. The Viking Division managed to advance but encountered minefields that delayed its advance. After crossing the Vali River and establishing a bridgehead, it stalled due to strong Soviet resistance. The Totenkopf Division had limited progress and was unable to repeat the successes of the previous day, facing a lack of resources and logistical problems. On the 23rd, the German commanders, seeing that the situation was worse than expected, decided to postpone a final attack that had been scheduled for that day. Meanwhile, the Soviets stepped up their offensives, preventing German troops from regrouping. The Germans were forced to take up defensive positions and deal with Soviet counterattacks. January 24th began with sub-zero temperatures and snowfall, which severely affected German logistics, hampering the movement of supplies and the transportation of troops. Despite the critical situation, the Germans still hoped to advance towards Budapest and rescue the besieged garrison. On that day, the Viking Division established a bridgehead north of the Vali River, but the overall result was disappointing, as the desired objectives were not achieved. On the evening of the 24th, the German leaders decided to change the direction of the attack to the northwest, leading to disagreements among the commanders, especially with Otto Giel, who wanted the attack to continue towards Budapest. On January 25th, German troops faced logistical problems and adverse weather conditions when trying to reorient their offensive, resulting in slow and frustrating progress. Meanwhile, the Soviet High Command was preparing a counterattack to drive the Germans out of Hungary, intensifying the pressure on the Axis forces. During the afternoon of January 25th, German forces attacked Petend, which had not been captured by the 1st Panzer Division the day before. On the 26th of January, the 9th day of Operation Konrad III, the morale of the German troops remained high. The attack by the 1st Panzer Division and Totenkopf began well in the morning, achieving an initial 12-kilometer advance towards the town of Wereb, surprising the Soviets. However, they were soon faced with counterattacks, especially at Wereb, which resulted in heavy fighting and the loss of positions by the German side. As Soviet pressure increased, German troops were forced to abandon a bridgehead north of the Vali River. The situation was further complicated by logistical problems, which prevented any significant advance. German generals Balck and Wöhler, frustrated with Giel's command, decided to redirect the attack to the southwest, but Giel objected, fearing that this would expose his rear to a Soviet attack. Despite conflicting orders, Giel attempted to delay the movement of his Panzer Corps to better prepare for the impending Soviet counterattack. On January 27th, weather conditions on the battlefront were severe, with snowstorms and sub-zero temperatures limiting visibility and complicating military operations. During the early morning, the Soviets launched an attack on Barachka, led by the 34th Rifle Division, which surprised the German troops of the Totenkopf, although they were able to repel the first assault thanks to the support of the Viking Division. As the day progressed, the Soviets also attacked the 3rd Panzer Division, managing to make dangerous progress towards Perkata, which threatened German supply lines. Although the Germans were able to contain this advance, they suffered significant casualties and were forced to halt their preparations for an offensive. In the afternoon, the Soviets intensified their attacks in the Petend region, managing to capture this town, which would isolate the German forces in the sector. Despite efforts to recapture Petend, the losses of the Soviet 23rd Tank Corps were notable, while German troops were drastically decreasing in number and operational capacity. By January 28th, after an assessment of the situation, German forces decided to withdraw and cancel rescue plans for Budapest, where the garrison was on the verge of annihilation. Despite the adversities, a breakout from Budapest was organized on February 11th, but only a small part of the troops managed to escape alive, while the majority were captured. Operation Konrad III, called off on January 28, 1945, marked the end of German efforts to rescue Budapest after weeks of intense fighting. Despite making gains in areas such as Lake Balaton, the Germans were unable to liberate the city or establish an effective defensive line on the Danube. Casualties were devastating, with the German 6th Army reporting over 21,000 losses in killed, wounded, and missing, in addition to the loss of 164 armored vehicles. In contrast, the 3rd Ukrainian Front also suffered casualties, but was able to recover more quickly. The failure of Konrad III was attributed to several factors, including a lack of resources, poor planning, and pressure from Hitler to act quickly. German generals such as Hermann Balck pointed to Otto Giel's insubordination and the ineffectiveness of the Luftwaffe as partly to blame, although these criticisms were seen as unfounded. The lack of coordination and the weakening of the German troops were also very important, which prevented a successful advance. Reflecting from the current perspective, it is argued that the initial attack plan from the south could have been more successful if it had been followed, since it would have allowed the German forces to be better prepared. In short, the lack of planning, resources, and haste in decisions were decisive in the failure of the last German operations in Budapest. So, did you know about this series of battles? Would you like to study them in depth? Well, here they are in my book, where I analyze all the offensives launched by the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front during the last months of the war, and of course, accompanied by color maps. I leave you the link and the discount code in the description. See you next Sunday. See you soon.